Konnichiwa. Today, we're going to talk about coming and going in Japanese. Now, iku and kuru are two of the first words we learn when we start learning Japanese. And we learn that they mean come and go, and broadly they do. But as we become more advanced, we understand that it isn't quite that simple. They have many metaphorical and more subtle meanings, but even the physical meaning doesn't correspond exactly to English come and go. Essentially, iku means go from where the speaker is to somewhere else, and kuru means come from somewhere else to where the speaker is. Isn't that just the same as English, come and go? Well, not quite. For example, you can say to someone on the phone, "Shall I come over to see you?" Or you might say, "Will you come to me, or shall I come to you?" And in Japanese, that's quite impossible, because you can't come to a place where you aren't. Coming means coming from somewhere where the speaker is not to the place where the speaker is. So you can't say to someone on the telephone, "Shall I come to you?" with kuru. You can only say, "Shall I go to you?" Yes, into. "Shall I go to you?" would sound strange in English, so we see that kuru and iku aren't exactly interchangeable with English come and go. Kuru can only ever mean move from where the speaker isn't to where the speaker is. Iku is not quite so strict. We can talk about someone ikuing from can to be when we are actually at sea. But kuru must always mean movement towards sea, the place where we are. And this is important to understand as we get into the more metaphorical meanings of kuru and iku. We've talked about some of the extended meanings in an earlier lesson, but still physical ones, especially those which involve connecting tira or iku to the chair form of the verb. So, motte kuru is bring to the place where I am. Motte iku means take from the place where I am. But the place where I am can actually be a time, or it can actually be a mental state of identification. So we get more advanced meanings, which are all based on a fundamental physical metaphor of coming to the place where one is, doing from the place where one is, or going from one place to another, but not coming from one place to another, because that isn't possible. So a very simple example is we may say, "Ame ganfutte kita," and we have almost an equivalent English expression. We might say it came on to rain. And the metaphor here is a time metaphor. Rain came towards us in time, from a time when it wasn't there to the time where we are when the rain is there. If we say, "Dandan ame ga futte iku," we say it's getting rainier and rainier, and we're projecting into the future. Iku is moving from where we are into the future. Now, since time, at least apparently, moves forward, we can only use iku in the sense of moving forward in time away from us, away from the point where we are, not moving backward in time away from the point where we are, because that isn't currently possible. So, ame ga futte iku, in this case, implies that it has become rainy, futte kita, and that it's increasingly going to do so in the future. Now we can also use kuru and iku in subtler ways still, concerned not with space or time, but with subjectivity, with our mental state. So a very common expression is onkette kuru, which might be rendered as come to understand, but this, of course, would be wrong. Let's take an example of why. We might say, "Benkyou suneba dandan tsugaku ga wakatte kuru." And that would be translated normally as, "If you study, you will come to understand mathematics." And as you can see, if you've been paying attention, there's contradiction here. you can't turn to a place where you aren't yet. In Japanese, you can't use kuru to speak about coming to somewhere that you aren't at this stage, but will be in the future. It would have to be iku, wouldn't it? So why is kuru used here? Well, if you follow this course, you probably know the answer already. Where kuru does not mean understand. It means be understandable, bo. Here, or literally, what it actually means is show understandable. So what we're in fact saying is that if you study math, will come to be understandable to you. In other words, math will come from being far from you to being nearer to you and being understandable. So we're using this in a subjective sense. And this is an important thing to understand, and it's important to understand that kuru and iku can represent movement in time toward one or away from one, movement in space toward one or away from one, movement in subjectivity towards one's mental condition or state or away from it. But also, iku can represent objectivity versus kuru representing subjectivity. And the reason for this is something we've already covered, which is that iku can mean moving from A to B while we are at C. Therefore, iku can represent a movement from one place to another that doesn't involve us physically, temporarily, the way, mentally or emotionally. So, if we say, Samuku na te kita, we're saying, it became cold, and I think that kita, kuru, is relating to us. It became cold, coming toward me or us. So what we're saying is that not just that it became cold, but implying that it affects me or us subjectively. Samuku na te kita. By contrast, samuku na te ita is more objective. It doesn't involve us, it doesn't imply that it in any way affected me or us, it just happened, it became colder. Because this is the ita that, in spatial terms, is going from A to B, objectively, without involving me, like this. Now, you may be asking, how do I tell when it's movement in space, when it's movement in time, when it's movement in terms of mentality and subjectivity, and when kuru and iku represent subjectivity versus objectivity? And the answer to that is there aren't any rules, and we shouldn't be looking for rules in cases like this. The reason we learn the way that these work is not as an end in itself, not as a set of facts to learn, but as an aid to understanding real Japanese. As we immerse in Japanese, as we watch anime, read novels, play games in Japanese, these things start to make sense. What we need is the principles on which they're based, which gives us a head start in making sense of them. But structure is never going to substitute for immersion. Structure is the underpinning that makes immersion quicker and easier and more understandable. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Prokeshi patrons, my producer Angel, who makes these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Cast is there.